A man living alone in a small, desolate town finds his routine life shattered when an injured German shepherd stumbles into his house late one stormy night. Blood trails on the floor, the dog's frantic gaze, and a scar that runs across its side holds secrets far beyond what he could have imagined. What started as an act of kindness to a wounded animal soon spirals into a series of mysterious events that tie the dog's past to the man's deepest, long-buried wounds. As the man follows the dog's instincts, he discovers a hidden truth that not only changes his life forever, but also unearths a heartbreaking secret about the dog's journey of survival and loyalty. But as the storm rages on outside, something in the dog's behavior keeps pointing to a chilling twist that the man isn't ready to face. The wind howled through the cracks in the old wooden cabin as Thomas stirred from his chair by the fireplace. The storm outside had been relentless for hours, snow piling against the windows, sealing him further into his isolated world. It was the kind of night no creature should be out in, yet the sharp sound of claws scratching at the door broke the eerie silence inside. He froze, his heart racing. For a moment he thought it was just the storm playing tricks, but then it came again. Desperate, frantic scratching, followed by a low, painful whimper. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He hadn't had visitors in years, not since he left the city to bury himself in solitude after losing everything he cared about. Slowly, he opened the door, and there it was, a German shepherd, soaked, shivering, and bloodied. The dog's eyes locked onto his, pleading without words. Snow clung to its fur, and there was a deep gash on its side, red staining the white snow beneath it. Thomas stood there, unsure. He wasn't a dog person. He wasn't much of anything anymore. But something about the way the dog pushed forward, collapsing at his feet, stirred a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Compassion. Without thinking, he scooped the dog up in his arms, its weight heavier than he expected, and brought it inside. Laying the dog gently by the fire, he grabbed an old towel and began cleaning its wounds. The dog flinched but didn't fight him. Its breathing was shallow, and Thomas noticed a long scar on its side, older than the fresh wound. He wondered what kind of life this dog had lived to end up here, on his doorstep, in the middle of a storm. "You must have been through hell," Thomas muttered, his voice soft, almost breaking. The dog let out a faint whine, its gaze never leaving his. For a moment, Thomas felt like it understood him, as if it carried its own burden of loss and pain. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice how the dog's eyes darted around the room, as if it were searching for something, or someone. There was an intelligence in its movements, a purpose, and it unnerved him. He thought about taking it to the nearest vet, but the storm made that impossible. He would have to keep it here, at least for the night. But then something strange happened. The dog, despite its weakened state, struggled to stand. It limped toward the door, pawing at it weakly. Thomas frowned. "No, you're not going back out there. You'll freeze to death." But the dog refused to stop. It whined, pawed again, and then turned to look at him, its eyes sharp and insistent. "What is it?" Thomas asked, more to himself than to the dog. The storm outside raged on, the wind rattling the windows. The dog barked weakly, then collapsed again, its body giving out. Thomas stared at it, unease settling deep in his chest. Something wasn't right. This dog wasn't just any stray. It had come here for a reason, and somehow he knew this night was far from over. The storm continued to batter the cabin, the wind screaming like a restless spirit outside. Thomas sat by the fire, staring at the dog as it lay motionless on the old rug, save for the shallow rise and fall of its chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than chance. This dog had come to him, and the urgency in its eyes lingered in his mind like an unsolved riddle. As the hours passed, the dog stirred again, lifting its head weakly. Its gaze sharpened as it looked at Thomas, then back toward the door. This time there was no barking, no whining, just a steady, penetrating stare. It was as if the dog was trying to tell him something. Thomas sighed, running his fingers through his graying hair. "You're not going to give this up, are you?" he muttered. The dog didn't break eye contact. It was unsettling, yet something in Thomas shifted. He grabbed his coat, hesitating as he glanced back at the dog. "All right, let's see what's out there. But if this is a wild goose chase, you're explaining it." The dog attempted to stand but faltered. Thomas quickly wrapped it in a thick blanket, cradling it in his arms as he opened the door. The icy wind hit him like a wall, cutting through his coat. But the dog didn't flinch. Instead, its head lifted slightly, its nose twitching against the cold air. Thomas stepped into the snow, his boots crunching loudly as he fought against the wind. "Where are we going, huh?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. The dog sniffed the air again and shifted weakly in his arms, looking toward the woods behind the cabin. Thomas hesitated. Those woods were dense and treacherous in this weather, but the dog's insistence made him take a step forward. The trees loomed above him, their branches creaking under the weight of snow. The further he went, the darker it became, the storm muffling all sound except for the pounding of his heart. Suddenly the dog let out a soft whine and squirmed slightly. Thomas stopped, turning in the direction the dog was focused on. His breath caught. In the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, was a faint glow. It wasn't natural, too steady, too deliberate to be a reflection or a trick of the light. He squinted, his curiosity overtaking his hesitation. "What is that?" he murmured. The dog whined again, its energy fading as it rested its head against his chest. Thomas tightened his grip and trudged forward, each step feeling heavier, as if the air itself were trying to hold him back. The glow grew brighter, revealing a small clearing up ahead. His pulse quickened. Something was there, but he couldn't make it out yet. As he entered the clearing, the source of the glow became clear. A lantern, hanging from a low branch of a tree. Beneath it was a small mound, half buried in snow. Thomas approached cautiously, the dog still in his arms, and knelt beside the mound. He brushed the snow away with trembling hands, revealing what looked like a wooden box, weathered and old, but intact. "What the?" he muttered, his voice trailing off. The dog's head lifted weakly, its eyes fixed on the box. Thomas hesitated, a strange chill running down his spine, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. He reached for the box, his fingers brushing against its rough surface. As he lifted it, the dog let out a soft, almost relieved sigh, and Thomas felt something shift inside him, like a door to a part of his past he had locked away was slowly creaking open. Thomas sat back on his heels, the old wooden box resting heavily in his hands. It was unremarkable at first glance. Worn edges, faded carvings, but there was something about it that felt significant, as though it held more than its modest appearance suggested. The dog, weak as it was, let out a soft huff, almost as if urging him to open it. Thomas hesitated, his breath visible in the freezing air. Why had this dog, a total stranger, led him here to this exact spot? With trembling fingers, he lifted the lid. It creaked open, revealing a collection of objects inside. A small, weathered journal, a child's mitten, and an old photograph carefully folded in half. The air seemed to thicken around him as he reached for the photograph, his hands unsteady. He unfolded it, and the sight hit him like a punch to the gut. It was a picture of a young girl, no older than 10, with a wide, innocent smile, and a German shepherd sitting proudly by her side. His chest tightened, the memories flooding back so fast they felt like they would drown him. The girl was Lily, his daughter, the same daughter he had lost 5 years ago in an accident he could never forgive himself for. The same dog, or was it? He stared at the scar on the dog lying beside him, and then back at the photograph. The scar was identical. "No," he whispered, shaking his head as tears blurred his vision. "This can't be. It's not possible." The dog let out a faint whimper, and Thomas looked down at it, his mind racing. Could it really be the same dog? The one that had been with Lily that day? The one he thought had died along with her? He clenched the photograph tightly, the edges crumpling under his grip. It didn't make sense, and yet, here it was, lying at his feet, leading him to a place only Lily could have known. He turned his attention to the journal, flipping it open with trembling hands. The handwriting was small and careful, unmistakably Lily's. The first few pages were filled with innocent entries about her day-to-day life, school, friends, and her love for the dog she had named Max. But then, further in, the tone shifted. "I'm scared," one entry read. "Max keeps barking at the woods. He doesn't want me to go there. He's trying to protect me, I think. But I don't understand what he's so afraid of." Thomas's heart pounded as he read on, piecing together the fragments of his daughter's fears and the bond she had shared with this dog. The last entry stopped him cold. "Max saved me today. He fought something in the woods. I don't know what it was, but I think it was bad. He got hurt, but he didn't let it hurt me. I love him so much. I hope he'll be okay." Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling. The pieces didn't fit together neatly, but the message was clear. This dog had been more than just a pet. It had been Lily's protector, her savior. And now, after all these years, it had found its way back to him. But why now? Why tonight? He looked at Max, the dog's breathing shallow but steady. It stared back at him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of everything it had seen, everything it had endured. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind swirling with questions. The storm had started to ease, but the air around him felt charged, heavy with meaning. "What are you trying to tell me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Max let out a soft whine, his gaze drifting toward the woods behind them. Thomas followed its line of sight, the shadows between the trees seeming darker, deeper than they should have been. And then he heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. Thomas stood, clutching the box tightly to his chest, and looked back at Max. "You want me to follow, don't you?" The dog didn't move, but its eyes stayed fixed on the trees. Whatever lay ahead, Thomas knew he wasn't ready for it, but he also knew he didn't have a choice. Max had brought him this far, and he wasn't about to turn back now. The sound grew louder, cutting through the stillness like a faint, haunting echo. It was almost human, a distant cry, a plea for help, but distorted, as if carried on the edge of the wind. Thomas's grip on the box tightened, his pulse hammering in his ears. He glanced down at Max, whose weak body seemed to tense ever so slightly, eyes locked on the dark path ahead. Thomas swallowed hard. Every instinct told him to turn back, to return to the safety of the cabin and pretend this night had never happened. But something inside him, perhaps the same force that had driven him to open his door to a dying dog, pushed him forward. He tucked the box under his arm, zipped his coat tighter, and stepped toward the trees. The woods were eerily quiet now, the storm's fury replaced by an oppressive silence that made each crunch of his boots against the snow seem deafening. Shadows stretched and twisted in the moonlight, and Thomas felt as though he were being watched, though he couldn't see a soul. He walked slowly, cautiously, every step feeling heavier, every breath visible in the freezing air. And then he saw it. Just ahead, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees, was a clearing. In the middle stood the faint outline of an old, dilapidated structure, a shed or cabin perhaps, its wooden walls darkened by time and decay. The faint glow of the lantern that had led him to the box seemed to dance faintly in the clearing, as though beckoning him closer. But it wasn't just the structure that caught his attention. There, in the snow, were tracks, footprints, too small to belong to an adult, leading toward the shed. Thomas froze, his breath catching. They couldn't be fresh, not in this storm, and yet the edges were sharp, unmarred by the wind or snow. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation, but none came. "Is this what you wanted me to find?" he asked Max, his voice trembling. The dog let out a faint whine, shifting slightly in his arms as if urging him forward. Thomas took another step, then another, until he was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at the shed. The door was ajar, creaking softly as the wind teased it back and forth. Inside, the faintest glow of light flickered, casting long, uneven shadows. Thomas hesitated, his fingers tightening around the box. His heart screamed at him to turn back, to leave whatever this was buried in the snow and shadows. But he couldn't. Not after everything. Not when Max had led him here. He took a step toward the door, the snow crunching loudly beneath his boots. The sound echoed unnaturally loud, as if the clearing itself were amplifying every noise. His breath fogged the air in front of him, and his heartbeat thundered in his ears. With a shaking hand, he pushed the door open wider. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering lantern hanging from a rusted hook in the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with tools and objects covered in years of dust and cobwebs. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the faint scent of something Thomas couldn't quite place. In the center of the room was a wooden table, and on it lay something that made him stop cold. A collar. It was old, frayed at the edges but unmistakable. The nameplate was still intact, though tarnished with age. He stepped closer, his breath hitching as he read the name etched into the metal. Max. His knees nearly buckled as a wave of memories crashed over him. This had been Max's collar, his daughter's dog. The same dog lying in his arms now. But how? How could it have ended up here, in this forgotten place? Before he could process the thought, the faint cry he'd heard earlier echoed again. This time it was unmistakable, and it came from behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The clearing was empty, the woods silent. Yet the sound had been so clear, so close. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The only answer was the soft creak of the lantern swinging gently above him. He turned back to the table, his mind racing. What was this place? Why had Max brought him here? And most of all, why did it feel like someone or something was still watching him? As his thoughts spiraled, Max shifted weakly in his arms, letting out a soft, almost mournful whimper. The dog's eyes were fixed on something in the corner of the shed, something Thomas hadn't noticed before. Slowly, he turned his gaze, his breath catching once again. There, buried under layers of dust and decay, was a small wooden chest, identical to the one he had found in the clearing. But this one was locked, its surface carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Thomas stepped closer, his hand reaching out almost instinctively. The moment his fingers touched the chest, a sharp gust of wind blew through the shed, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the room into darkness. And then, from the shadows, he heard it. A faint whisper, chilling and unmistakable. "Help her." Thomas froze, his breath caught in his throat. The whisper seemed to echo in the darkness, circling him, seeping into his very bones. He strained to see, his eyes barely adjusting to the pitch-black room. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the weight of those two words. Help her. Max stirred in his arms, letting out a weak whimper that snapped Thomas back to reality. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as he swept it across the room. The light landed on the small wooden chest in the corner, its carvings now seeming more intricate, more deliberate. The symbols glimmered faintly, as though reacting to the light. Thomas hesitated, his hand hovering over the latch. He could feel the weight of whatever was inside, something old, something important. With a deep breath, he set Max gently on the floor and knelt by the chest. The dog's eyes followed his every move, as if silently urging him on. Thomas tugged at the latch, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked tight, the key nowhere in sight. Frustration bubbled within him. After everything he'd been through tonight, was this where it would end? Then he remembered the first box, the one Max had led him to in the clearing. Quickly he retrieved it, opening the lid and rummaging through its contents. His fingers brushed against the old journal, the photograph, and the mitten. But nothing resembled a key. He was about to close it when his thumb caught on a hidden compartment along the bottom. With a soft click, it slid open, revealing a small rusted key. Thomas's heart raced as he picked it up, his fingers trembling. He turned back to the chest, the whisper still echoing faintly in his mind. Help her. The key slid into the lock easily, and with a soft twist, the latch clicked open. For a moment, Thomas hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stop. But he couldn't. Not now. He lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters tied together with a frayed ribbon. They were old, the paper yellowed and fragile, but the name scrawled on the top letter stopped him cold. Lily, his daughter's name. His hands trembled as he untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though it looked rushed, desperate. "Dad," it began, the single word enough to bring tears to his eyes. He read on, his heart sinking with every word. "I don't know if you'll ever find this. I don't know if Max can bring you here. But if he does, it means you're close. It means you can save her." Thomas's breath hitched. Save her? Who was Lily talking about? He kept reading, his mind racing. "She's lost, Dad. She's been lost for so long, and Max has been trying to protect her. But he can't do it alone. You have to help him. You have to find her before it's too late." The letter ended abruptly, as if she hadn't had time to finish. Thomas stared at the words, his mind spinning. Who was she talking about? Was it herself? Someone else? None of it made sense, and yet deep down, he felt the urgency of her words. He glanced at Max, who was watching him intently, his eyes filled with a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. Thomas reached for the next letter, but before he could open it, the whisper returned, louder this time, clearer. "Help her, she's waiting." The flashlight flickered, the beam dancing across the walls as the wind picked up outside. Thomas's pulse pounded in his ears. He shoved the letters into his coat pocket and stood, lifting Max into his arms once more. The dog let out a faint groan but didn't resist. As he stepped out of the shed, the wind howled through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, distant sound. A voice. It wasn't the distorted cry he'd heard before. This time it was unmistakable. A girl's voice calling out faintly, carried on the breeze. "Dad, help me." Thomas's blood ran cold. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him back into the woods, toward the voice. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The voice grew louder, clearer, guiding him deeper into the darkness. And then, through the trees, he saw it, a faint figure standing in the snow. Small, fragile, and unmistakably that of a child. His breath caught as he stumbled forward, tears streaming down his face. "Lily?" he called out, his voice breaking. "Is that you?" The figure didn't move, didn't answer. It simply stood there, waiting as the wind whipped snow around it. Thomas's heart ached, hope and fear warring within him. He quickened his pace, but as he drew closer, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the storm. "Lily!" he screamed, dropping to his knees in the snow. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whimper of Max in his arms. Before he could process what had just happened, the snow beneath him shifted. He looked down to see another set of footprints, small, fresh, leading deeper into the woods. The whisper returned, louder now, almost urgent. "Help her. She's close." With a renewed sense of determination, Thomas stood, clutching Max tightly. He followed the tracks, his heart pounding with every step. Whatever lay ahead, he knew this was only the beginning. The storm had led him here for a reason, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. Thomas followed the tracks, each step feeling heavier than the last as the forest seemed to grow darker, colder. The voice had faded, leaving only the sound of his labored breathing and Max's faint whimpers. Yet the tracks remained sharp and clear, guiding him toward something he couldn't yet see but could feel, a pull deep in his chest, as if the forest itself were leading him somewhere he was meant to be. The path opened suddenly into a clearing. At its center was an old stone well, half collapsed, its edges covered in moss and ice. The sight stopped Thomas in his tracks. The air around it felt different, heavier, as if the well were alive, breathing in the silence. The footprints ended here, circling the well's edge. Thomas stared at it, his heart pounding. He knew instinctively that this was it. This was where all the questions, the pain, the whispers, the impossible events of the night, would finally make sense. Max stirred in his arms, his head lifting weakly. With a faint groan, the dog squirmed until Thomas set him gently on the ground. Despite his exhaustion, Max limped toward the well, his nose brushing against the cold stone. He let out a low, mournful howl, the sound carrying through the clearing like a lament. Thomas hesitated, his hands trembling. "What is it, Max?" he whispered. "What do you want me to see?" Max barked softly, his gaze fixed on the well. Thomas took a step closer, peering over the edge. The well was deeper than he expected, the darkness seeming to stretch endlessly downward. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw something. Movement. At first it was faint, like ripples on the surface of water, but then it grew stronger, clearer. A figure emerged from the shadows, rising slowly. It was Lily. Thomas's breath caught, his knees nearly buckling. She looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared. Her bright eyes, her soft smile, her small hands clutching something close to her chest. She looked up at him, and for a moment, it was as if the years of grief and guilt melted away. "Dad," she said softly, her voice echoing from the depths. "You found me." Tears streamed down Thomas's face as he reached out instinctively, his hand trembling. "Lily, is it really you?" She nodded, but her smile faded, her eyes clouding with sadness. "I've been here all this time. Max kept me safe. He's always kept me safe." Thomas looked down at Max, who was now sitting beside the well, his head bowed, his body trembling with effort. The truth hit Thomas like a lightning bolt. Max hadn't just been a dog, he had been her protector, her guide, even in death. He had brought Thomas here for this moment to finally bring her back. But why? Why here? What happened to you? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Lily's gaze dropped, and she clutched the object in her hands tighter. "The day I disappeared, I followed something into the woods. I thought it was a game, but it wasn't. There was something here, something dark, and it took me. Max tried to save me. He fought so hard, but he couldn't stop it. He kept me safe for as long as he could." Thomas's heart ached, guilt consuming him. "I wasn't there. I should have protected you. I failed you." Lily shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "You didn't fail me, Dad. You were hurting too. That's why Max brought you here. He wanted to give you the chance to save me, to save yourself." Before Thomas could respond, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. The darkness in the well shifted. No longer just shadows, but something alive. Something that had kept his daughter trapped for so long. A cold, otherworldly presence rose from the depths, and Lily's form began to fade. "No!" Thomas shouted, reaching for her. "I won't lose you again." "You won't," Lily said, her voice echoing faintly. "But you have to let go of the guilt. That's the only way to save me." Max barked sharply, breaking Thomas's trance. The dog moved toward the well, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Thomas realized then that Max had always known the way forward, that this moment, this choice, had been his purpose all along. With tears streaming down his face, Thomas reached into the well, his heart full of love, pain, and hope. "I'm sorry, Lily," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." The darkness recoiled, and the clearing was flooded with light. Lily's form grew brighter, more solid, as if the love and forgiveness Thomas poured out were breaking the chains that had bound her. Max let out one last howl, a triumphant, mournful sound that echoed through the clearing. And then, it was over. The well was empty, the darkness gone. Lily's figure stood beside Thomas now, her hand warm in his. Max lay at their feet, his body still. Thomas knelt beside him, tears falling freely as he stroked the dog's fur. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. "You brought her back." Max's chest rose and fell one last time, his eyes closing peacefully. Thomas held him close, his heart breaking and healing all at once. He looked at Lily, who smiled through her tears. "Max saved me," she said softly. "And he saved you too." Thomas nodded, his heart full of gratitude and love. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, he stood, holding Lily's hand tightly. The storm was gone, the forest silent and still. Together they walked back toward the cabin, leaving the past behind and carrying Max's memory with them, a reminder of love, loyalty, and the power of redemption. And as they disappeared into the light, Thomas whispered, "Sometimes, love finds you in the most unexpected ways."